Well, I thought that was just a really great opening for our conference. Wasn't that a great panel? And such gracious hosts. I remember Alf and I did a reconnaissance almost 2 years ago, maybe. We had a delightful lunch with Justice Stevens on a waterfront in Olympia at a nice seafood place. I'm thinking, why do I live in Colorado? And then I remembered, yeah, we get it flown in daily. But what we got flown in this morning was some of the wit, wisdom, common sense, practicality, and amazing revelation about our sister state, Washington State. And Washington State had been kind of absent for a while from participation. I don't know why. Washington was very active for a while, and I remember flying into SeaTac for workshops and other things we did, and then, you know, so the practical reaching out part of this is very important. And so next on the agenda, I think Alpha and I need to go to Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska. You think we ought to go to Nebraska? We've tried to get some of the justices of their court involved, and they listened attentively. I called every one of their chief justices, but they haven't gotten here yet. So we may have to go to their area. But I promised to use a little Steinbeck in introducing the California panel, and I may have to put some more in it. My senior thesis at the University of Notre Dame, this was a year-long thesis we had to do in the history department, was the writers of the 30s. I was a history major, but I convinced the English department and the history department that maybe I could do this combined kind of paper, and it was hugely important, I think, to just understand what was going on there in the Great Depression and what the writers of the 30s were contributing. So from Steinbeck, before I introduce the panel, I've come to believe that a great teacher is a great artist. Teaching might even be the greatest of the arts, since the medium is the human mind and spirit. I think we actually heard some of that from Justice Stevens. And I'm even going to mix in the experts that have to do with this, you know, and they connect the human heart to the brain, to their expertise, and then the ability of courts to express in a story that relates to tradition and law, the facts of the case and the ongoing tradition, what the decision in the context of that movement, that progression in history means. And so we all in this room get to do a part and a piece of this, and it is a great privilege. The 19 and a quarter years I had in the Colorado Supreme Court were incomparable. And now I'm off the court and don't have to do those weekly conferences. Good luck, Justice Hyde. Yeah, I do miss that. I miss that, but at the same time, that preparation the night before, I'm not missing. I'm getting a little bit better sleep than I used to. So there's beauty and truth, even if it is a dreadful beauty. Steinbeck. All right, so the other presentation is actually going to be Alf Brandt, who's a very interesting executive director we have for this Dividing the Waters, because he gets to do everything, and his connection with the California legislature in this most crucial of all times is very interesting, that he's been plugged into trying to put together this panel at the same time he's putting together bills and advising legislators and then watching the attorneys do whatever they need to do as these great laws that California is now working on in the most extreme of circumstances are coming to fruition, and they're having to look at their water law system. And you know this, Alf, and I said this to the great Joe Sachs. I said, Joe, when you figure out what California water law is, let the rest of us know. Because you've tried every system and every concept, and every system and every concept has run up against the reality of a devastating 500-year drought, or is it worse than that? So that's the context of this California panel coming on the heels of the Washington panel, and we all know that these are the well-watered states, right? California with the snowpack that it usually expects from the Sierra, the Cascades and your Great Mountain Ranges in Washington. Who would have imagined that we in the interior West would now be looking at you and saying, well, what's the next movement? What are you working on? And isn't it interesting? And then to have a water year like we had in Colorado this year, when that Miracle May, as it's called, produced about 4 or 5 million acre feet that we didn't expect into Lake Powell. Oh my gosh. When we thought we would have to under-deliver from Powell to Meade and the lower basin. There is nothing like what we get to do. It so affects our fellow citizens and fits into the history and culture of these great lands that we share. Everything west of the Mississippi. And now we're reaching out east of the Mississippi because they're having drought events and relooking at their mostly riparian law or whatever it is in change. Justice Ron Roby, one of the great things I've been able to do as a co-convener of this group since 1998 and seeing Justice Roby come on is working with this great judge who was also a Department of Water Resources director for California under the first Jerry Brown administration, right?
Same Jerry Brown.
So same Jerry, is it really? Is it the guy who was the mayor of Oakland?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I didn't realize. No. And Lester Snow, who also held the same position at the outset of the huge 21st century drought.
I didn't start it.
He didn't start the drought. Okay, well, good. And you're in the position with the California Water Foundation then to follow up and work from a perspective on what should we try, what should we do, groundwater and surface water, a little bit more of a standing back to see what will help that. And of course, Andy Sawyer, who's been with the California Water Resources Board for what, since the 1970s, late 1970s? Right? We're glad to have you, and you've attended a lot of these conferences, and you have contributed much over that time. So I think we have the right panel here, and I hope that we can just keep the ball moving forward that the first panel helped us with. So Al, if you have an overview on what California's been up to in the most dramatic water management, water law saga of our time. California.
I wish I was as good a writer as Steinbeck, but unfortunately not.
What hath California wrought?
Thank you, Justice Hobbs. I'm going to do a brief introduction. I'm actually going to let the panel be the engagers. I'm going to give you a little bit of background, and this is leaning toward the legislature, toward what we've done. We've done so many things in the last 6 years, responding to crisis, whatever the crisis was, and you'll hear a little bit about the Delta, and a little bit about, but I'm going to start with the system, the way the system works, so you know the key things of what drives us, and that is this fact. That is the fact that 2/3 of the water in California falls in the top third of California. 2/3 of the demand falls in the bottom third of California. So we spent the 20th century building amazing projects to take the water from where it is to where it is. And you can see the kind of projects we have. We have federal projects. We have the largest Bureau Reclamation project, the Central Valley project. We have the State Water Project, which is actually the only state to have a state water project that this magnitude, that takes water from the north all the way down to San Diego. Takes it all the way down to San Diego. We've got local projects as well. Southern California and City of San Francisco, all of them have built their own projects as well to take water from the Sierra or from the Colorado River. So you can see the kind of mix of those things. And these are just the artificial versions of artificial movement. We use the rivers, Sacramento River, San Joaquin River, and the tributaries as part of our water conveyance system as well. I'm going to tell you a little bit. You can't talk about California water without talking about the Delta. It's that triangle. It is unique because unlike most deltas, river deltas that have one river coming out and hit the water, hit the ocean at a wide spot, this is the opposite. It has two rivers coming in, hits the San Francisco Bay or goes into San Francisco Bay at a narrow spot at Carquinez Straits. That leads to a different mix of the value as a habitat and salinity, and the mix of salinity and fresh water. It's both the heart, literally the heart of the water system, because we got to get the water from the north of the delta, get it across the delta to the pumps that are in the south end of the delta, basically down in this area. That is the State Water Project's Clifton Court Forebay. So the delta is key, but it's also a key habitat at the same time, which makes it a challenge for us. You can see how it works. The water comes in, including the salt water from the San Francisco Bay, pushes in. Most of the water that goes out of here comes from the Sacramento River watershed. So even though the pumps are down here in the San Joaquin River watershed, the water goes basically from up at a delta cross channel, comes straight down here. Well, you can imagine a habitat and a plumbing system leads to conflicts, and we've had many conflicts. And so, for some years we've had issues also with subsidence, because this is peat, it's not soil. So as you plow it, and this was one of the earliest areas, 1852, where they started farming the delta. This is one of those early areas. When you plow it, it oxidizes. It's not like soil. It oxidizes, goes into the air. It releases carbon. And so that leads to it getting deeper and deeper. So some of these islands are as deep as 30 feet below the water level. So that's another water issue that we have to deal with, because they're surrounded by levees, but all that hydraulic pressure is pushing down all the time. So the delta is just a natural place for us to be involved in conflict and some of the things we do. But here's some other key maps that you can see. This is this week's map. You can see the drought, how serious it's become for us. That central part, that north part of the darkest red, that's where our water supply is. So you'll hear more about that from Andy. You can see the kinds of reservoir levels we have at this point in the last few weeks. All low, a lot of yellow space there and those kinds of things. The other piece is we have groundwater aquifers, and we have a huge aquifer right in the Central Valley. And this is what's changing. This is one of the big changes, and this is one of the biggest challenges for us. We have a huge aquifer that provides water in drought, largely, because we built the Central Valley Project system to bring surface water from the north to make sure that we weren't losing the Central Valley and losing all that water that's in groundwater. But in the last few years, just in the last few years, they've gone to pumping. We don't have a groundwater rights system. We don't in the Central Valley. We have adjudications in Southern California in those basins, but we don't have one in the Central Valley. And so this is the kind of change we've had. The thing that changed, we have shared rights. Yes, they all share the responsibilities and rights, but we are the last state without a system to manage that. We're starting to build one, and I'll get to that. But it was this depletion in the last few years. And it was the ability, as technology, it was satellite images and the sensors on the ground that be able to tell how much water is in the soil and how deep it is, how much subsidence is happening. This is the image that probably moved us. We created a statewide groundwater management system in 2014. This image, was from NASA and from USGS. This kind of showing how much water and how much groundwater we had lost over just a few years. That's over 3 or 4 years in this last drought. So that is what moved us to finally take on something that had been, you couldn't even touch it. I mean, I had farmers, when we started talking about just getting some information about how deep it was to groundwater in 2009, I had farmers come to me, it's my groundwater, it's none of your damn business how deep it is to my groundwater. And so that's the kind of challenge we had. We could never do it. Governor Schwarzenegger vetoed 3 bills on groundwater in his period. So it was a challenge. We have other challenges. We have nitrates. You may have heard about these. This is largely from agriculture, but it's from other sources as well. Wastewater, septic systems. You can see where it is. It's in the Central Valley largely. It's also in the Salinas Valley, the lettuce capital of the world. And that has been a continuing challenge for us to see how to deal with it, and it's something we've been dealing with probably since 2007, how to deal with that groundwater quality and the mix. When the groundwater goes down, it concentrates the nitrates. So it makes it even worse. So we have serious issues along those lines. We also have some communities that are losing their groundwater. And this woman, this is from the New York Times, this woman has no water coming out of her sink. That's East Porterville, California. There's no water. The system has no water. So this is the kind of stuff we've done. We put temporary tanks, we've brought in bottled water, but this community has no water, none anymore, because it has no access to groundwater. So we've been doing a number of emergency things. So what we did, one of the first things we did, one of the big things that we did, started in 2009. We did a number of pieces of legislation to do things, partly for the Delta, partly about changing Delta policy, to adjust the fact that the Delta is going to change. Remember what Delta means? It means change. Well, that's what's happening with this and preparing for changing. And then water conservation. You may have heard of 20 by 2020. Or we're reducing water use in urban areas by 20% by 2020. So that's a significant piece. The groundwater elevation monitoring system that I mentioned, we have adopted. That was the first step of us to be able to just say, we just want to know how deep it is to you, and start gathering that on a statewide basis, but using local agencies to do that. And then we had some requirements on water use diversion, changed reporting presumption. Just did that, changed huge amounts. We had always required people to report their water use. Very few people did. But we changed the presumption to say, well, if you don't report it, if there's ever an adjudication, there's no presumption. If you report it, there's a presumption that you have used water. But if you don't, then you have nothing. You have to prove it yourself. So that changed significantly. And then also we came up with a water bond that was huge that then got rejected. The other piece that's been significant is, and this is something that Felicia Marcus from the State Water Board asked me to make sure to put in, is we passed a law saying it is the policy of the state of California that there is a human right to water. And we put it in the domestic use preference you may know about. Many of your states have a domestic use preference for water rights. We put it in that section and said for drinking, not for everything, not as broad as domestic use, which in our state includes things like some cows and some gardens and things for your own house. So we did that. It was vetoed at first by Governor Schwarzenegger and then passed into law in 2012. And originates from the United Nations Treaty, but we passed it ourselves as a law. I'm not going to go through all these, but you can see this is the stuff that's happening. These are happening, many in the legislature, but in 2012, 2013, that was in the administration. We have been changing water law substantially over the last 6 years, and a lot of things have been happening, a lot of change has been going on. We're trying to struggle with that. Andy's probably at the forefront or the center of a lot of this change. Last year, we also passed a $7.545 billion water bond. This was actually a lot of my work, and the voters supported it. Two-thirds to one-third. Amazing vote. So we were able to do that. But notice what we're funding. This is different than a lot of what we've done. Safe drinking water, number one thing. And that was the one thing that changed. That was barely in the one that passed originally that the voters never approved. Barely in there. Protecting rivers has traditionally been in there. But water storage is huge, different. Groundwater cleanup, groundwater sustainability. Those kinds of numbers, we haven't dealt with that because groundwater was always the thing we had to stay away from. So we did that. And this is the centerpiece. This is the thing you'll hear more about, Groundwater Management Act. So what we did is we said, okay, it's sustainable. The policy is we're going to manage our groundwater basins sustainably. We don't want any undesirable results, which means things like no significant unreasonable depletion. But instead of doing a statewide system and you have to go to a state water board, we said we're going to give the locals a chance. They've got to come up with a sustainable water management plan for their groundwater. And if they don't, then we do have a state backstop, and that's Andy's State Water Resource Control Board. If they either don't create an agency to create a plan, or don't create a plan, or create a plan that doesn't really achieve sustainability, then the state can step in and say, this is how you do it. This is what you need to do. And of course, for the adjudicated basins in Southern California, we exempted them from the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And then this last year, just actually 2 weeks ago, the governor signed a groundwater adjudication statute, how we're going to do it. Some good changes, provides for a state role, provides some basis of information, basin borders, other kinds of things that can come from the Department of Water Resources. It also, for you, this may be interesting, we have to deal with who adjudicates a groundwater basin. So one of the things we did was we said it's not going to be a local judge, and it's going to become complex. It's going to be presumed to be a complex adjudication, which means the Chief Justice is the one who can assign a court. And some of you are here from our complex litigation departments in our bigger courts. Thank you because it's coming your way. So thank you for doing that, and that's going to be an important part. Also streamline some discovery and service process, allowed special masters, provided for special masters. And then the other piece that this was where some of the fight was this year was the Farm Bureau really wanted to say, oh, let's just do adjudications. And if we do adjudication, we can just ignore SGMA. And that was, we ultimately fought through that, and ultimately the governor stepped in this summer and said, no, we're not going to do that. We were able to kill that early on, but they kept pushing to say, oh, well, if we're doing adjudication, then SGMA should be irrelevant. And allowed for stipulated judgments by 75% of the parties. I think that's it. That's where that's the kind of stuff we've been doing. It's been busy time, and I'll leave it to those who are in the middle of it to talk about it.
Don't go very far.
Okay.
Thank you. As Justice Hobbs said, I'm Assistant Chief Counsel at the California State Water Resources Control Board, which is responsible for the state's water right, water quality, and now drinking water programs. I'm going to focus on the current drought and the lessons we are learning. This is a drought like none before. You heard this morning that much of the state of Washington is an extreme drought. We wish we had it so good. That map you saw of Alps showing the dark red, that's exceptional drought. That's worse than extreme drought, and that's where most of our water supply comes from. The lesson we're learning, paradoxically enough, is we need to face the reality that we have been avoiding for decades and take on the problems that we have been putting off in order to deal with this drought and in order to deal with the future drought or no drought. The current drought has near record low precipitation. This graph shows that there have been a couple of years with lower precipitation than we are currently have, but certainly near low precipitation, and that has been coupled with record high heat. 80% of the water in the state is used for agriculture. Your irrigation needs increase when it's hotter. Outdoor irrigation for urban use needs go up when it's hotter. And of course, the snowfall is less. You get more rain and less snow. And the snowpack is, or used to be, our biggest reservoir by far. Snowpack is much lower. This compares January 2013 with January 14. Tremendous decline in snowpack. This year was even worse. A recent scientific article took tree ring studies to determine what the precipitation was, what the temperatures were. From that, calculated the snowpack, calibrated it with the more recent measurements that indicate what the snowpack has been for the last 100 years or so, and that study indicated, as Justice Hobbs said, this is the worst snowpack in 500 years. Demand was somewhat lower then, so we're dealing with record low availability, record high demand. As I think Alf said, I'm filling in for Felicia Marcus, who is a much better speaker and, among other things, always works in something about beer in her presentation. So I borrowed this slide where she quotes from Abraham Lincoln saying that if you present the facts, the people can be counted on to respond accordingly. The great point is to bring them the real facts and beer. And what we have, let me get into some of those real facts that we have been avoiding. One is the decline in fishery. This slide shows one species, the winter and Chinook salmon, and the dramatic decline we've seen in previous droughts, but over the long term as well, in the winter run Chinook salmon populations that have resulted in their listing as an endangered species. That is not limited to the salmon stocks. All the native fish seem to be in trouble. The other, as Alf mentioned, is the lack of groundwater management in all but a few areas of the state. That has been dramatically illustrated in subsidence. It's also resulted in seawater intrusion in some areas. That we're seeing it more dramatically in this drought, where declining water levels are causing wells to go out and people left without a water supply. One issue we've been avoiding over time, and in fact, the areas where we have adjudications have largely ignored it, is the effect of groundwater pumping on interconnected surface water supplies. This graph shows the Central Valley watersheds and the effect over time of increased groundwater pumping. It's gone from a period where the tributaries to the Sacramento-San Joaquin River, the Sacramento River Valley shown in green, and the San Joaquin Basin shown in purple here, have gone from where the groundwater basins were contributing to the surface water flows in very substantial amounts to where now the surface water flows are a net loss to the groundwater basin. The groundwater pumping has increased to the extent that net flows into the delta have been reduced by 1 million acre-feet per year. It's kind of a sore point because some people say this isn't as dry a year, at least in terms of precipitation, as it was in 1923. I don't remember being curtailed then, or 1976. Now, some of it is they just don't remember. But part of it is there's 1 million acre-feet less flowing in the river. So one would expect more severe curtailments in this extraordinary drought than previously, and that's a reality we haven't really been facing. Another reality is that we have not been determining our water rights. This map shows the surface and groundwater basins in the state that have been adjudicated. It's only a small portion of the state. Some of those adjudications have not been minded and are out of date. But largely, we've been dealing with avoiding adjudications. In fact, the late Frank Trelease, former dean at Wyoming Law School, later professor of University of Pacific, McGeorge, talked about the California solution. The California solution, as he put it, is you have a water problem, throw water at it. You get a conflict, instead of resolving all the issues about what priorities are, et cetera, you bring in an imported water supply or find some other way to put off actually having to deal with that issue. Justice Roby has complained in the past that we leave so many water law issues unresolved. We don't litigate to the point of getting precedents. And that's largely because of what Professor Trelease called the California solution. He's identified something that is actually even worse about it in a law review article he wrote in response to the failure of groundwater management proposals by Jerry Brown 1.0 in 1978, where groundwater management failed, is that people argued the answer to groundwater is to bring in more low-cost surface water so we don't have to pump the groundwater. He pointed out then that that was something of a pipe dream. The money isn't there to pay for those projects, certainly not at the price that would make it cheap enough for irrigators to use. But the hope of that bailout prevented a solution. We've been putting things off or looking to the California solution. But times have changed. We seem more inspired now, although we didn't credit the author, Niccolo Machiavelli, with the principle that never waste the opportunity offered by a good crisis. We took advantage of this crisis and especially the impacts on groundwater that were illustrated, that to get some major reforms through the legislature that seemed impossible a few years before. This shows the signing ceremony for the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. We have used expedited legislative procedures intended for budgetary items known as budget trailer bills. They are legitimately budget trailer bills because they are tied to an additional funding for emergency action, but mostly they're there because of the need to act quickly during the drought. Among other things, we fixed a loophole in the 2009 legislation Alf talked about. The legislation requires best professional practices in measuring best available technology and measuring diversions. About 75% of the diverters were using a loophole to not do that. That was closed. We had a lack of enforcement authority. The penalties for illegal diverters were less than the value of the water stolen. The penalties, at least during an exceptional drought, are now consistent with the value of the water. There were no penalties for violating monitoring requirements. Those were imposed. The drinking water program was actually switched from the Department of Public Health to the State Water Resources Control Board. So drinking water and surface and water supply and water quality are merged. Among the things we did, the governor issued executive order demanding certain actions, also suspended the California Environmental Quality Act so they could be done promptly. One of the things he called for is statewide water conservation to reduce total urban water use by 25%. The State Water Resources Control Board adopted regulations to achieve that, and as this graph showed, it's been the local water districts in compliance with the regulation have actually exceeded the 25% reduction in surface water diversions. We have had, as in our new drinking water responsibility, had to provide emergency water supplies to many areas whose water supplies went out during the drought. And we've adopted some emergency conservation or emergency flow regulations in specific areas. This shows areas in certain tributaries of the Russian River where the salmon were in extreme stress. The flow on the right shows just enough flow to maintain the water quality where some of the fish are surviving. When the flows got lower, the water became polluted and warmer and they couldn't survive. The conservation is intended to avoid that kind of circumstance. We adopted in-stream flow regulations setting minimum flows for certain tributaries, 3 tributaries to the Sacramento River that are important for the spring run Chinook salmon and steelhead, and requiring curtailments by all diverters with all priority rights to meet the minimum migration flows in those streams. Statewide, we have relied mostly not on emergency regulations setting minimum flows, but simply the rule that it's an unauthorized diversion when you're diverting when there's no water available in your priority. And of course now we've got real penalties for that violation. There's now complex litigation in front of Judge Kerwin about letters we sent out notifying people that there was, in our calculations, insufficient water, so I won't get into the details of that, but we have been trying to manage, consistent with priority, the available water supply. My time's run out, so I won't go all the other things we're doing, but we're very busy trying to manage in the drought when we left this backlog of undecided, undetermined issues, including what we should set for flows to protect the fishery, how we're going to enforce priority when we've never adjudicated, how we're going to enforce where before we weren't enforcing.
One of the things I want to clarify right away, I've been in the water business a long time, and usually when you have a name, Lester, you would let people call you Les, but less snow in the water business. So I aggressively push back on that. To play off of one of Andy and Alf both, the headline in the Sacramento Bee this morning was Folsom Lake at its lowest level in 20 years. And literally a few acre feet away from that probably doubling. So lowest it's been in well over 40 years, I think probably by the time of this time next week. So it's still getting a lot of people's attention. Since we had a Steinbeck quote, I've got a Mark Twain quote that always resonated with me. And if you follow Mark Twain, though, all of his famous quotes have come under some suspicion. And if he didn't say this, I'm sure he intended to. And that was, he came to California before he understood how much the beauty of a river was greatly enhanced by the presence of water. Just think about that for a little bit. My orientation I want to bring to this comes from having occupied a lot of different seats on the water bus. I guess I would put it that way. Local, state, federal, and now NGO. And one thing I would say about the water bus that drives policy, every seat has a steering wheel. And which wheel is actually connected is a random kind of event. And you never quite know until after the fact who was able to make that sharp turn. What drives me and the issues that I look at is, this is especially true in California, but more broadly in the West, our natural resource reality, including hydrology, is changing faster than our water policy and institutions are capable of adapting. So in my opinion, we're falling behind. And we're at a point where incremental change isn't sufficient. You can't tweak things. You can't build a wastewater recycling plant and say we're done. Or like some in California, that would think we'd build a couple more big reservoirs and we're kind of out of this. We are so far beyond that. What we need is step change. And that's a term from biology where an ecosystem fundamentally shifts to kind of a different structure supporting different elements in that ecosystem. So, an illustration of the changing reality is kind of happening right now in California, where we still have these incredible drought effects as everybody is looking at the forecast and worrying about El Nino flooding of historic proportion. So we actually have a scenario that's not unlikely that next year the governor will have to continue a drought emergency declaration in parts of the state and declare a flood emergency in other parts of the state. And with very little ability to take advantage of that flooding, because it will happen in an urban area, and then that implicates the whole stormwater management issue for us and how we're going to take advantage of that. Now, one illustration of being able to make a step change is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, SGMA. It really has made a fundamental change in the way water managers are looking at the water system. And for some of them, begrudgingly so, and they opposed it. However, they recognize what it can mean and the need to do something different. And I'll hit that just a little bit more in a minute. An illustration of not a step change was the efforts we made in 2009 to have 20% by 2020. So it was a regulatory approach to conservation. You need to reduce your per capita use by 20% by 2020. That's an illustration of the floor ceiling issue, meaning when we pushed that and when the legislature pushed it and the administration, the thought was that should be a ceiling. A floor, no less than 20%. But a lot of the response was, well, we now know how much we need to do, and we don't need to do any more than that. And actually, in some cases, you had boards telling their staff, stop pushing that program, we only need to do 20%. Now, the great thing that's happened since, with the state board leadership and the governor's leadership, we've seen communities that have relatively easily reduced their per capita use by 50%. So you have a whole new marker out there. But I think if, absent the drought, we would see people coming in at 17% and saying, we worked really hard on that, and give us a break. And I don't think you would see people go into 40%. So that's kind of this trade-off when you go to the blunt object of regulation. Oh, my screen went off. I was still reading that, Andy. It went off here, so I don't know what to do. No, sorry. I guess a couple of other points I wanted to make is what I used to call the death cycle of legislate, regulate, litigate, then go back to legislate again. And that's the part I don't think we have time to keep doing that. And we have to interrupt that cycle, and it gets to the issue that Andy raised of never let a crisis go unused. And you have in California now the highest level of public attention that we've ever polled on water. And they have the drought and water issues way above jobs in the economy, way above the quality of the schools. We just have never seen anything like that before. So while a lot happened in 2015 to start changing water policy, we have to do much more in 2016 while you still have at least some of that attention on the water issue. The other point that I would make along those lines, you can't legislate or litigate creativity. You can make somebody comply. You can choose a winner or a loser in a dispute, but you really can't force the level of integrated water management creativity that we all seek. So I look at legislation, litigation, more like strategic moves in a chess game. You got to know what your moves are, 4 or 5 moves in advance, and you use the legislation, you use strategic litigation as a way to achieve a greater outcome. You need to build incentives, positive and negative incentives, to move to a more creative, more integrated approach to water management. And an example of that's happening right now in California in terms of settlements. There's a state board proceeding on the San Joaquin, and nobody thinks the state board will get it right, including Felicia, the chair. So there's an encouragement for having parties come together outside of the state board process and look at things that are not in the jurisdiction of the state board, such as moving levees back and restoring floodplain habitat, as well as having the flows necessary for the fisheries. And those are the kind of efforts where you start moving outside the box, outside the regulatory standards, outside of the legal provisions, and start looking at what does it take to solve this problem. What I find in settlements and other situations, you have a whole mix of motivations of people around the table. Turns out fear is a big motivator. Enlightened self-interest, hatred of the State Water Resources Control Board. It's not personal, but it is that this unknown saber that gets rattled tends to motivate people. We'd rather do it to ourselves than have somebody else do it to us. The other, which is gratifying when it happens, is actual interest in good public policy, as odd as that can be. One thing I want to bring up, especially having listened to the panel previously, it's the issue of combat science. And this may be something that Andy can talk about a little bit, because he certainly has seen his share of it. And that is, in a lot of situations, you have lots of data, and it's data that really hasn't been analyzed. So you get into a dispute, and the two sides hire their experts and pull the data out that supports their case. And the way I try to think of the chain of this is you have data, you analyze it, you develop information, you pull together the information you have, you build knowledge, and knowledge supports good public policy. Now, let's remind people, you don't need any of those first 3 things to set public policy. So you don't need a shred of information, knowledge, of any sort. If you don't believe me, just observe Congress right now. And That's an issue that has to be taken on. We have to be developing the data and information outside of the conflict. So a couple points I want to throw out to kind of fuel a little more discussion is the issue of adaptive management. Now, especially given climate change, we could all agree today, every expert could agree today, how to fix that Andy slide about the fisheries. Here's how we need to operate these reservoirs, here's the habitat we restore, and in 10 years we would agree that doesn't work anymore. And so how does our systems respond to that changing reality? Instead of what traditionally in California, every water right, this is the way we've operated for 80 years, there's no need to change that. That's not what the future is going to be. Well, let me close on a real specific issue that is queuing up as we speak, the interesting litigation. We know that some of the flood districts in the Central Valley, San Joaquin Valley, have had attorneys evaluate suing the groundwater pumpers for subsidence-induced levee, levee protection. So the land has subsided because of the groundwater pumping. So the flood districts are looking at the issue that next time there's a flood, that 100-year levee is actually now a 50-year levee. And who's going to pay for the damage that results for that increment? Now, I don't know how that will manifest, but I do know that some of the flood districts are spending money to try to figure out how to deal with that. Somewhere in there is an opportunity to start connecting some dots. And these opportunities need to be taken advantage of. And one of the things I want to say about SGMA, just to back up, SGMA happened because of some conditions that allowed the attention on this issue. But you ended up getting the votes in the legislature through a classic campaign. There was a campaign that was run just like it was for a presidential candidate. It was looking at assembly member districts, who in those districts can get to the assemblyman. It was vote counts going on, and it got turned into a very classic campaign. We cannot assume that people respond to just the facts or good public policy. If we're going to make the kind of step changes that we need to make, it's a combination of science, of engineering, of legal understanding, and hardcore political campaigning to get things done. So I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.